What happens when a 50-year-old law meets the modern world? Today, we're unpacking the latest twist with Title IX protections and gender identity. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. Today, we're diving into a topic that's got everyone talking. From school board meetings to the halls of Congress, gender identity and how it relates to the protection of women and girls in education is on people's minds. There's a new joint House Resolution 165 causing quite the stir, and we're here to break it all down. Stephen, ready to untangle this web?
Let's do it.
So before we kick things off, there has been a ton of legislation over, I'd say, probably the last 8 years that really aim to legislate how trans people deserve to exist in this world and what they can and can't do. We had the bathroom bills back in 2016, and it just kind of gone from there. And I wondered if there was anything like this happening on your side of the pond. Is everybody over there kind of having this panic about what to do with people, or are you guys just hanging out?
Yeah. No, it is very similar, isn't it? I mean, obviously we have J.K. Rowling, who's a sort of famous participant in the various battles that are going over this. It's a very tricky issue, very, very polemic, and very heated views on both sides, really. So in Britain, though, we tackled it quite early. So our main law around sort of the protection of trans people is called the Gender Recognition Act, and it was enacted in 2004. So back in the day when people weren't really talking quite so much about these things. The problem with it is that it hasn't been updated ever since. So it's now woefully out of date and really, really needs updating. But because of how sort of controversial all this is, very difficult for governments to really sort of tackle it. But the Scottish government did have a go at this a couple of years ago, and they came up with a sort of Scottish law that only applies in Scotland, which really modernised the Act, and it had a sort of a number of sort of important changes. It basically made it much easier for people who were trans to be recognised as trans, to legally change their gender, change their name, and all that kind of thing. Now, as people may or may not be aware, we obviously have a devolved government in the UK. So Scottish Parliament is allowed to make laws that just affect Scotland, but they're not allowed to make laws that would also affect England. And there's a provision in the sort of devolution agreement that means that the main Westminster Parliament can override Scotland if they feel that the law they've passed would impinge and somehow sort of be a problem for the laws we have in England. And this is what they did in this case. So the Westminster government said, no, you can't have this law. We're not having it because it would undermine equalities legislation in England. And you can understand sort of where they were coming from, because if it's easier to be recognised as trans in Scotland, then obviously people could go up to Scotland for just 3 months, which is all it took. You just had to live in the identity for 3 months, and then you could be recognised. Whereas it's 2 years in the rest of the UK, I think 2 or 3 years. So they were saying, well, people just go up to Scotland and do that and then come back to England, because you can obviously move quite freely back and forth.
Yeah.
So they were saying it would undermine our own equalities laws. But it obviously, the Scottish government were absolutely livid about this, as were a lot of people in Scotland, because they saw it as purely ideological at the time. Obviously, we had a Conservative government. They were very anti-trans in a lot of the sort of the rhetoric and so on. And so the Scottish government challenged them in the courts, and it went to the Supreme Court, and they lost the case because obviously the court was just ruling on whether the government was allowed to do this. They weren't ruling on the rights and wrongs of changing the gender recognition law, and so they lost the case. So, but it just shows really this is the only time since devolution back in the 90s that this law has actually been invoked. It's the only time that the Westminster government has overruled Scotland or any of the other countries as well. So it just shows how sort of controversial this is, and how it doesn't seem to be getting any easier. No one really seems to be finding any solutions to this. The Scotland issue was a lot around making it too easy for people to be recognised as trans, and the challenge was that would mean, for example, you would have say rapists in prison, male rapists pretending to be trans women so that they could get moved to women's prisons, and they could rape at will, which is a slight examination of that shows that's absolutely nonsense. There's no way that was going to happen. It's a very easy one to say, well, all of those cases are assessed on
Right.
their, on their merits, the individual merits. There's no way the government would let a sort of man do that. And then again, it was about protecting sort of women-only spaces and things like that. And they said that this
Hmm.
law would mean that trans women would have an automatic right of access to sort of, hostels for women and that kind of thing. Which again, it was
Hmm.
challenged. But the thing about it was there was an enormous amount of misinformation and lies told about this. It was almost impossible to find out what this law actually did and what its impact would actually be. And the two opposing camps were
Hmm.
poles apart in terms of saying what it meant. So they were just disagreeing on those fundamental facts of what the law would do, and it was really notable. It wasn't just arguing opinions or whatever. It was literally arguing about the facts of the case, as you often see in sort of debates these days, just alternative realities.
It's such an interesting thing because I think a lot of these kinds of issues are very stemmed from people's fear of the unknown and things that they're not personally comfortable with. And as not a trans person, I remember taking an anthropology class in college, and we
Mm.
talked about all these different gender identities all throughout the world and in all these different cultures and like
Wow.
societies that were
That wasn't in
matriarchal and all
Florida,
this.
I'm guessing.
No, no. In Colorado, very liberal school. Yes. Yes. But it was the first time I had ever really been exposed to anything like that. I'm from a small town. I knew trans people existed, and,
Mm.
I had seen them in media and other things like that and was
Mm.
aware. Other than that, like not really anything. And I had
Mm.
no idea that there was all of these different cultures. And the Native American culture in the US has the highest honor for people who are trans, and they call them two spirits. And it's
Mm.
this incredible honor in their communities. And it's really
Right.
interesting if you're looking at the ways that trans identity has, if we're just going to say all of it was trans identity with these kinds of things, has
Mm.
shown up in other cultures and been revered and respected in a place of a bestowed honor. And then how in the US, the uncertainty and unfamiliarity and uncomfortability of people is really driving this legislation.
It's
Yeah.
difficult to understand, isn't it? I mean, there's a parallel to like go back to the 1980s with people who were gay, and
Hmm.
straight people just couldn't get their head around this and thought they were
Hmm.
some sort of weird, dangerous sort of
Yeah.
subculture and all that kind of stuff. But nowadays, obviously, no one, well, apart from in some place in America, but in most countries, people no longer feel that way. And I think that's the way it will go with trans. I mean, I remember a number of years ago now, it must have been about 10 years ago when I was working at the Department for Education, I got involved with this because I was working on exams and there was a challenge from the trans community. It was too difficult to change people for trans people to change their name on exam certificates, which obviously they
Mm.
would want to do. And also that exam documentation had gender markers on. So it's quite important
Mm.
to measure like pass rates for girls versus boys and that kind of thing. So, but that they just routinely put gender markers M or F on your exam papers and things. And obviously they were saying, well, that you've got kids at school who are suffering from gender dysphoria. They're very sort of concerned, and the last thing they need is to be misgendered on an exam paper when they're already stressed, that kind of thing. So,
Right.
so we managed to sort out some of these issues. But as part of that, I was sort of working with quite a few of these trans groups and got to sort of understand a little bit about it and realized it really taught me how little I understood about it and how
Yeah.
all of the sort of misconceptions and things I had. And obviously, most people, that's what it is. If you speak to somebody on the street, that they will have just completely the wrong idea.
Right, right. And I think it's so much of if you know people and they kind of humanize a issue, cause, any of that kind of stuff for you, then it can really move you forward. And it's been interesting because I've actually seen there's a lot of new media coming out about famous people who have trans friends. And there's a new one with Will Ferrell
Mm.
coming out that's a documentary with him and his friend and just their friendship and how he supported his friend during her transition. And it's so interesting. And I
Mm.
think that the more that people can see the human side of humans, hopefully the more we can find the humanity again.
I mean, underlying all of this, of course, is some of the statistics that we were looking at, particularly among young people who are sort of grappling with these issues. The suicide rate is staggeringly high.
Yeah. And the
And
murder rate.
lots and lots of people are killing themselves because these questions, yeah, absolutely, it's everywhere. These questions are really challenging people, and they're causing depression, mental illnesses, and suicide. Have quite high
Hmm.
rates of suicide as well. So it is important that we tackle it and that we find the right solution. I
Yes,
mean, not us,
absolutely.
governments.
Yes.
one of those times
You
when
and
I'm
I.
to be a politician. Not having to try and figure this out. Yeah.
You and I are going to solve everything. With that, should we
Yes.
jump into
Yes.
the podcast?
We should. Let's solve it. So, we're talking about Title IX. And Title IX might be from the 1970s, but it is still shaping debates on issues like this today. So, where should we start, Sarah?
Let's kick off today with some history on Title IX. So, Title IX refers to Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. It states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied in the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Sounds pretty straightforward. And remember, back then, the word sex was, in this context, very uncontroversial. It was just a word that people used, and it was not going to invoke any kind of response from people.
That's right.
And originally, this was all about ensuring that no one was excluded from educational programs based on their sex, which means making sure that girls and women had a fair access to education and that girls in sports had their sports funded at the same rates of boys. And so, when we look back, this was very much about trying to bring women forward from, a society that did very much value and invest in males more than females, and then moving towards, trying to protect that. This protection was then expanded to cover sexual harassment, sexual assault in the 90s, which again was another movement of our society forward, recognizing that there's more things that we need to be investing in, protecting from, those kinds of things. And then during the Obama administration, it was expanded again to protect trans students from discrimination. And Stephen, what's the core issue with the resolution that we're talking about today as it relates to Title IX?
Well, yes. So Title IX, on the face of it, is quite a simple thing. It's about protecting women, but there are political differences on this. But one of the key political differences is now around this definition of sex and the fact that it was expanded to cover sort of gender effectively, and when people are changing their gender as well, which obviously people on the right tend to disagree with, most people on the left tend to support. So the Obama administration brought in these changes through a variety of different rules and sort of guidance and so on around Title IX. And the Trump administration, of course, then rolled it back as soon as they could. And in fact, they went further than that. Rather than just rolling back changes, they actively stated that cisgender athletes' rights were actually being infringed by transgender athletes if they were also competing. So sort of very much a step back, and obviously all schools and educational organizations had to sort of get to grips with that. But then, of course, Obama lost the election. In comes Biden, and the Biden administration then set about changing that. So they started straight away with a couple of sort of different rules that they introduced. And in particular, back in April 2024, the Department of Education then issued this sort of very important rule that flipped the definition back again to include protection for gender identity, sexual orientation, and it also included sort of more sort of advanced stuff around sexual harassment and sexual assault as well, basically making it easier for women and girls to bring sort of challenges to men that they thought had assaulted them or harassed them in any way. So the resolution that we're talking about today, the House Joint Resolution 165, wants to roll that back again, to basically put things back to the way they were under the Trump administration. So it's one of those sort of frustrating examples where every time government changes or sort of the political colour of the government changes, everyone seeks to flip things back to the way it was last time they were in power as well. Whereas actually what people really need in these sort of spaces is a bit of stability. You want to know what the rules are for years and years and years, and you just operate those rules and everyone gets familiar with them, and you can put in place sort of effective programs. Yeah, how can you put an effective program in place if you think, well, next year it's all going to change again?
Right.
And it all comes down really to this definition of what does sex really mean in the context of Title IX.
Yeah, it sounds to me like a classic case of who controls the narrative controls the law. And I think that one of the more interesting things is how sex has changed its definition from the 70s to now. And it's considered okay to say your sex assigned at birth, and you don't say your gender assigned at birth. And so that's, a big movement from where we used to think of sex as gender, and now it's very much kind of this biological marker. Some folks are saying that this new rule ignores the basic biological facts. What's the argument there?
Yeah, so proponents of the resolution will argue that by including gender identity under sex-based discrimination, this rule undermines protection for women and girls. It's effectively degrading what it means to be a woman. And they're particularly concerned about issues like transgender women participating in women's sports and therefore having like a biological advantage because they claim that they are actually biologically male. And also using women's facilities, which they claim, it's unfair competition, but it also compromises the safety of women in that these spaces are no longer sort of sacrosanct just for women, really. This is a view that's gained a lot of traction recently, particularly among conservative lawmakers and obviously conservative governors. So it tends to be very much a sort of state-by-state issue.
Yeah, and on the flip side, opponents of the resolution see things very differently, I would say. And they argue that this rule is essential to creating a safe environment for all students, especially our LGBTQ plus individuals. What are they saying around to that?
Yes, so the opponents are pushing back very, very hard on this, as you might expect, really, and say the rule is about ensuring that no one is discriminated against, period. So in educational settings, just as in other places, trans people suffer an enormous amount of discrimination, and as the argument goes, and so they need these additional protections, much more so than some other people in these settings as well. So protecting LGBTQ plus students from harassment and discrimination is absolutely crucial, and this does, of course, include trans people as well. And the rule helps clarify that Title IX covers these issues, and so that these trans people, as well as other people in the LGBTQ plus community, should enjoy equal protections. And they argue that actually rolling back these protections in the way that this resolution wants to do would actually make schools less safe, particularly for these transgender students who already suffer these very significant risks.
Yeah, and I think now is a good time for us to just kind of get into the arguments behind everything. There's two pretty starkly divided sides, and there's not a lot of in between. Either people can kind of wrap their brains around what it is to protect trans youth, trans people, and give them space to exist in the world. There's pieces there that are always going to, fundamentally be a little uncomfortable, but like some people can just kind of move themselves that way, and then other people just can't move that way. The basic biological there is the thing that is driving it. And I think it's even more interesting with the Olympics happening and kind of talking about what people in sports are doing and how we're kind of moving this forward.
The example of Imani Khalif, the Algerian boxer at the Olympics, is a really, really interesting one. So Imani is a woman and was born a woman. Has always been a woman, has always lived as a woman, has never had any sort of questions over her gender at all. However, she was banned from boxing by a sort of a boxing organization on the grounds that she'd failed a gender test. Now, we don't know exactly why she failed that gender test, but it certainly wasn't because she was transgender in any way, because she isn't. It's speculated that, in fact, she has one of these developmental conditions, a hormonal developmental condition, which means she has high elevated levels of testosterone, so that her body develops in some ways to develop the kind of musculature you might expect on a man, but certainly not developed as a man. And the Olympics are obviously so hugely supportive of her. They let her compete and so on, but there was an enormous furore about the fact that this trans woman was being allowed to compete. It's completely untrue. It's completely maligned. I think she's taking legal action, and quite rightly so. Everybody waded in on this. And it just simply wasn't true. And it shows how, again, this arguing about the actual fact rather than arguing about opinions matters. But she illustrates an important thing, that not everybody with two X chromosomes is a woman, and not everyone with an XY chromosome are men, because there is an important second part to that, which is the various hormonal balances that can be different. So there are all sorts, and there's about 40 different types of conditions that can mean that whether you're a man or a woman is actually a little bit blurred, which is why this sort of blanket claim that there is a biological men and there are biological women is simply not true. And most of the time it doesn't matter, but when you get to an elite sport and you get to an elite level like this, particularly with a sport like boxing where strength and obviously is very, very important, then it does become an issue. And then the elite organizations themselves have to draw the line. They have to say, okay, if you've got this amount of testosterone, if you're over the line, you can't compete. If you're under the line, you can compete. But then what about other people who have biological advantages? Like Michael Phelps has ridiculously long arms. Now, he's also an amazing athlete and worked incredibly hard and deserves every medal he won. But at the same time, he has unusually long arms, which gives him a massive advantage when he's swimming. Should he not be allowed to compete? Or,
Right.
Usain Bolt, who has like really long legs, should he not be able to compete because that gives
Yeah,
him an
or
advantage in
Simone
running?
Biles is
Again,
really
it's
short and
some,
she can,
yeah, yeah,
she's
and
short, she's
yeah,
powerful. One thing that's really perplexing to me is that we've kind of generally agreed that there's some levels of testosterone that's allowable to be identified as a female in competition sport and identified as a male. And we have these levels, they're doing these tests, there's, the Olympic Committee has agreed upon this. You look at Michael Phelps, like nobody's trying to get Michael Phelps out of anything because his arms, I think, are taller than I am.
yeah.
Like, but we can all kind of
Absolutely.
recognize that.
If you work really, really hard and it's your whole life, this sport, you want to know it's fair. There's nothing
Yes.
worse than thinking you lost unfairly. But Title IX it's an interesting element to this because it's pretty much unique, I would say, to the United States that college sport is so important. In most countries, it's just not. I mean, in the UK, if you were good at sport, you wouldn't go to university to do it, right? You wouldn't
Yeah.
get a scholarship to go to university because you're good at a sport. That's just not the way it works. Sport at university is just very much a friendly amateur thing, and so you wouldn't get these kind of issues arising
Right.
in UK universities. I think it's the same in most countries, but in America, of course, it's very important because college sport is the route to becoming professional and to really getting on, isn't
Or
it?
the route to getting an education because our education here is so expensive and you want a scholarship.
Absolutely.
So, we've got a classic clash of perspectives here protecting women's spaces versus ensuring non discrimination for all. But let's get practical. If this resolution passes, what's the real world impact?
Well, if House Joint Resolution 165 makes it into law, it would nullify the April 2020 federal rules, so schools wouldn't have to follow the expanded definition of sex-based discrimination, which is a little bit unusual. People who understand how resolutions work will know that resolutions are generally just saying they're expressing an opinion on behalf of the legislators. They don't have a legislative impact, but that's not necessarily true. Some can, particularly joint resolutions can. And this is an example where it would actually wipe out this rule. And that would mean then that educational institutions across the country may well roll back protections for transgender students and potentially revive some of the Trump era sort of Title IX policies and so on. And then let's just remember here, it's important to remember that the DRA rule isn't totally or even mainly about transgender rights. It is about a whole raft of different things that are designed to protect women. So a big part of it seeks to make it simpler for women to bring forward allegations of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and so on. And so if you nullify this rule, all that goes as well. But politically, this is much more about drawing battle lines because it's very unlikely to pass the Democrat-controlled Senate or, in fact, survive a presidential veto. But it does set the stage for the 2024 election and beyond.
And one other really interesting piece about this, and I think that we've even showcased this on our own podcast right now, is how pervasive of an issue the trans issue is in our society, that we've spent essentially the entire time talking about what it means to be trans, where trans people are allowed to exist,
Yep.
and we're not talking about any of this sexual harassment and abuse part of this. You're just so distracted and focused on this huge raging debate. All right, so that aside, it's less about kind of an immediate change and more about messaging for this next election cycle and the narrative that we're speaking. So speaking of the future, I hear this ties into Project 2025. What's that all about?
So yeah, I mean, we've spoken a lot about Project 2025, which we say is like the playbook for a future Trump administration. Now, of course, Trump and his team do now deny that. So that itself is sort of a point of contention. But Project 2025 includes a plan to sort of revisit and potentially roll back all of these recent changes to Title IX. It includes redefining sex strictly as your biological sex at birth. So it's basically setting the scene for this resolution not passing. And then following the election, if you have a Conservative president, then the Conservative president would actually make these changes anyway. And also there's another little bit of it, which is to say that they would also roll back these sort of expanded ways for women to bring sexual harassment, sexual assault charges as well, because they feel that it goes a little bit too far in terms of not protecting protecting the accuser rather than protecting the accused. So there's sort of a bit of an issue there as well.
Well, you hate to see that. Seems a little bit like we're setting up a chessboard for 2025, and we'll definitely have to keep an eye on this one. So thanks, Stephen, for breaking it down. And as always, the legal landscape around Title IX is anything but boring.
Absolutely, Sarah. And to our listeners, stay tuned. So this issue isn't going away anytime soon, but we'll always be here to help you navigate the twists and turns.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks.